Good afternoon, and my name is Stefano Bertuzzi. I'm the Chief Executive Officer at the American Society for Microbiology, and I'm here today with a very special guest, Dr. Peter Hotez. Welcome, Peter. Good to have you.
Thank you, Stefano. It's great to see you.
Wonderful. Peter is, many of you know who Peter is, but let me just say three things about Peter of his many jobs. He is a professor of pediatrics, molecular virology, and microbiology at Baylor College of Medicine, where he is joining us, we're joining from right now. He's also the founding dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine, also at Baylor College of Medicine. And he is co-director of the Texas Children Center for Vaccine Development. And in his abundant spare time, he's joining us today for a wonderful conversation. So we're very grateful, Peter, that you found time to chat with us today. I'm sure ASM members will be delighted to hear your thoughts.
Well, I love my association with ASM, and as I've said to you 1,000 times over the years, anything I could do to help ASM and its members, it's my privilege. It's a
Thank
great
you. And
organization.
we're honored by that. And anything that we can do to help you and your message, we're delighted to do that. Before we get started, I'd like to read out something that Harold Varmus, former NIH director, former director of NCI, said in his accepting speech of an award that he was given by an organization called Research America. Dr. Hotez is also a recipient of a distinguished award from Research America. This was in March 16, on March 16 of 2016, so a while ago, well before the pandemic. And let me read what Harold said at that event. I want to say one thing at this perilous moment in American history. It is now not enough to say that we need medical research to improve health, to extend lives, or to sustain the economy. We need to preserve and promote our science in all of its forms because it represents the best that we have ever been and must continue to be as a nation. For at our core, we are curious, pioneering, receptive of new ideas, welcoming to all those who have those ideas and come here from anywhere to pursue them, and are ready to work with others anywhere in the world to promote human welfare through science. In other words, research and America are inextricably linked. Sustain that connection, shout out fearlessly, and emphasize that exclamation point in these perilous times. So, Peter, you just published last year a book, The Deadly Rise of Antiscience. Let me ask you, compared to what Harold said, which was in a sense going already in this direction in your book, what do you think went wrong?
Well, it hasn't entirely gone wrong, and I actually agree with most of what Harold says. And of course, I know Dr. Varmus very well because of the Public Library of Science and PLOS, and he was one of the founders, and then I started one of the PLOS NTD journals. But, I think a couple of points to take away. First of all, we are a nation that is built, or at least built partly, on the greatness of our research universities and institutions, which is when science comes under attack. It's one of the reasons I say it's so dangerous. It's not only dangerous for the scientists, it's dangerous for the nation. We are a nation built on the greatness of our research universities and institutions, right? That gave us, you name it, the Manhattan Project, Silicon Valley, that gave us the cancer moonshot, that gave us NASA. And I also saw this firsthand when I served as U.S. Science Envoy in the State Department and the White House in the Obama administration, 2015, 2016. I mean, why were we admired? Why are we admired? We're admired because when you talk to leaders of countries all over the world, they all either have studied or aspire to study, time in one of our research universities, or have their sons and daughters study in our research universities. And that's very powerful. And that's why when science comes under attack, it's it's not only, as I say, dangerous for the scientific community, it's dangerous for the nation. It's extremely destabilizing. And so what went wrong was, according to book and the research I did for the book, was an organized attack on biomedical science, with some similarities, not complete overlap, but some similarities to the attack that the climate scientists sustained 10 years ago. So now it was the attack on biomedical scientists, and it took the form initially around vaccines, and claiming that vaccines were something nefarious and dangerous. And the point is that here, it wasn't, as many claim, or as many state, they call it misinformation or infodemic, like it's just some random junk out there on the internet. It's neither of those things. It was organized, it was deliberate, it was predatory, it was politically motivated. And here's the reason why we have to talk about it, even though it's unpleasant to talk about. It killed 200,000 Americans. 200,000 Americans, Stefano, needlessly perished because they refused a COVID vaccine, beginning with the Delta wave in the last half of 2021, after vaccines were freely and widely available. And yet they became political targets from people with nefarious intent,
And
and they
let me
paid for
stop
it
you
with
for
their
a second.
lives.
We'll get into that in some detail because your book does a great job at documenting with data and charts and tables that exactly that point, and I want to talk about it extensively. Let me stop you for a second, and first of all, thank you and commend you for the role that you take on in trying to connect science and society and explaining the role that scientists do, just like you were
As
just
you, by
saying.
the way, Stefano, I learned a lot from you. So
Well, thank you. You're very humbling. Actually, I'm learning from you. So let's call it a reciprocal conversation.
sounds good.
But let me ask you, what was the motivation? And then we'll get into the substance of the issues, like you were going already. But first, I'd like to start from a personal aspect. Why did you, in your, as I said, in your abundant spare time, you have a very active research program yourself. You develop vaccines that are incredibly important. You have a family that's demanding. You have administrative responsibilities, and you became a leader in trying to explain the role that scientists have for people, for society. What was the motivation for that?
Well, it was somewhat unplanned. I mean, as I sometimes say, there were two parts. I have a dual life in science. One was very deliberate and planned, and the other was more much later that I took this on. So the planned part was I did my MD and PhD in New York at Rockefeller University, which used to be the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. That's contributed so much to the history of microbiology in the United States, and Weill Cornell. And I started making a human hookworm vaccine as an MD PhD student in Anthony Cerami's lab. And now, 40 years later, that's showing evidence of protection in clinical trials. So it's about the right time frame for a lot of vaccines. And then began doing other parasitic disease vaccines. And then we wound up making two low-cost COVID vaccines for India and Indonesia, using a similar technology, and so, which was very gratifying. But the point is that all was planned. That was what I aspired to do and set out as an MD PhD student in my 20s in the 1980s. The unplanned part was having four adult kids, including Rachel, my youngest daughter, who has autism and intellectual disabilities, and knowing that one of the original assertions against vaccines were false claims that vaccines cause autism. So I wrote the book. The book was called Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism, which made me public enemy number one or two with anti-vaccine groups, but it also gave me a front row seat to what this was all about and allowed me to watch it unfold. So I inserted myself because there was a vacuum, just like I inserted myself when neglected diseases were being neglected, and helped to build that ecosystem for neglected tropical diseases. So I began kind of this parallel life in public engagement, which that's the part that took me by surprise. By the way, I'd gotten a call not long ago from someone who's well known to ASM, Matt Waldor, who's a outstanding microbiologist at Harvard Medical School.
Harvard.
Matt and I were roommates in college, and
Ah,
so he called me the other day, and he said, Pete, because back then I was Pete. He goes, Pete, we always you knew you wanted to study parasitic diseases and make vaccines, but honestly, we never saw the public engagement piece coming, and quite honestly, I didn't either. It was I just saw this vacuum around neglected diseases and then vaccines and false claims that cause autism. I said, look, here I am. I'm an MD PhD scientist. I develop vaccines, and the assertion is vaccines cause autism. I have a daughter with autism and intellectual disabilities. If I don't say something, who does? And just felt compelled to do that. And it's put me in a very scary place at times, especially with this new politicization around vaccines. But on the other hand, I do find it meaningful, and I even though it's I don't quite know where it's all going. It in some ways now, given all the deaths from people who needlessly perished because they refused the COVID vaccine, 200,000. I'm of the opinion that I'm really committed to saving lives, science for saving lives, which is why I got my MD PhD, why you got your PhD, and is now it's almost as important to counter the anti-science as it is to do the science. And
what a powerful message, Peter. Saving lives, the mission that you are called to as an MD, PhD, and we are all as biomedical scientists. And now saving lives through connecting with the people and really taking on those big issues. So let me ask you, still at a personal level, and I'm an avid reader, and I don't like to just comment on book. I like to dig deeper in the book. So I read your book very carefully, and I want to ask you a few questions regarding the book. And since we're talking as your personal experience for now, uh, one of the things that was really difficult for me to read in your book at a personal level, evoking many emotions in me personally, but also thinking of you exactly such a credible leader in science and in carrying this message because of Rachel and because of many other leading activities that you had. When I read the emails that you published, where you are called, and I'm quoting, "Dear Satan spawn, Hotez, enjoy, shoot up, and die," and emails where niceties like this are distributed, left and right. What do you do? How do you feel? How do you pick yourself up and continue doing what you're doing? Many people would feel, let's hide away from here. Why am I doing this? I wanted to become an MD and work in the ward and in the hospital and do research in the lab. Tell me more about that.
well, I think it's important to remember, and it is very shocking. When it first started to happen, that was the initial response, right? You crawl back into the turtle shell, or whatever metaphor you want, but then you start to realize that the reason this is being done is to intimidate, that I'm a threat to this monster that we sometimes call the anti-vaccine, anti-science movement. And it's evolved over time. Originally, I was a threat because the anti-vaccine groups were dependent on monetizing the internet. They were selling phony autism cures and nutritional supplements that nobody needed. And if you go to Amazon.com and type in books on vaccinations, they're almost all phony anti-vaccine conspiracy books. So that became its own industry. But then it became a political enterprise on the far right. And then I had people like Steve Bannon publicly calling me a criminal. And so, first of all, when Steve Bannon calls you a criminal, that's a pretty authoritative source, right? So, I mean, you're like, what the heck is this? Steve Bannon calling me a criminal, or Roger Stone and this kind of stuff. And Marjorie Taylor Greene going after me on Steve Bannon's War Room podcast. And then you realize what this is all about. I've become a political target, and that's, and oddly, I take some, not comfort in that's not, but I can rationalize it. Then I realized that I'm a political target, very much like the Mendelian geneticist Nikolai Vavilov was when he was a threat to Lysenko during the Great Purge in the 1930s in the USSR, or like Sakharov was, to the Soviet Union in the 1960s and 1970s and 1980s. And so knowing that not that it's comforting, because now you realize that compared to what it was, with people, a bunch of hucksters monetizing the internet, now I'm a major target of the far right of a major political party in the United States, and that's both scary, but it's also helps me make sense of it, that these are all dog whistles for unwell people, then to full on attack.
Okay, we're going to get to the causes of that later on because I want to try to unpack that for you. This incredible thing that is happening in our country and in the world, I would also say. Before we go there, I want to go back to where you were already headed, and that shocking number of 200,000 individuals who during the pandemic died because they refused to take the vaccine, which was readily available. Literally, this country was swimming in vaccine, and yet so many people chose to die in a certain sense. This is a number that comes through your book from the beginning to the very end. It's really something that that had a big impact on you and on all of us. But you have researched and did a lot of work in understanding what caused this, and you have in particular some data showing also that the U.S. behaved differently than other countries, like for example the U.K. in this respect. Do you want to tell us a little bit about this number, how it came about, and the differences with other countries?
Sure, and the numbers are fairly similar to other estimates. So Charles Gaba, the health analyst from ACA Signups, came up with 180 to 235,000. So, actually split it right down the middle there. Mark Lipsich's group at Harvard Chan School of Public Health came up with a similar estimate. So did the Kaiser Family Foundation. They came up with like 234. So they're all coming between 180 and 300,000 deaths. If anything, the 200,000 number may be an
Conservative.
underestimate. Let me give you a good comparison. Let's compare, for instance, and we'll talk about what. And it wasn't uniform across the country. That's the other part. They were in states like my
The
state of
red COVID. Yeah.
Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas. So let me give you a good example of what that means. Let's compare the state of Texas with the nation of Canada. So they actually have a similar population, 30 plus million, similar size economy. Canada has suffered 51,000 COVID deaths during the pandemic. Texas, 100,000. So basically exactly double. So why was that? Because after vaccines became freely, widely available in the nation of Canada, sometime in early mid 2021, the deaths halted because Canadians, for the most part, got vaccinated. In Texas, the numbers doubled. The number of deaths doubled because so many Texans refused to take a COVID vaccine because they were a victim of this predatory movement. And that's the shocker, right? That 40, 50,000 Texans needlessly dying. In a paper I wrote called The Great Texas COVID Tragedy, I argue this is the single worst tragedy that ever affected the state of Texas.
Yeah, that is tragic. Although the data changed a little bit with the various with the variants, right? So Omicron behaved a little bit differently in that respect. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, the deaths really accelerated in the Delta wave, and that accounts for a lion's share of those 200,000. There are also significant numbers of deaths among the unvaccinated in the BA.1 Omicron wave that started in early 2022. And there, you started to see some deaths even among the vaccinated because of waning immunity, and the virus was so different from the original lineage, which ultimately got corrected in the boosters. But so there, what you really needed to ensure that you weren't going to lose your life was to get a booster, get that third immunization, which unfortunately, for the same reasons, a lot of people didn't get.
Yet CDC was considering fully vaccinated even without the boosters. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I never understood that. I pushed really hard. I going on the cable news channels as I did multiple times a day, and I kept on pleading with Americans, get your booster, get your booster. And because immunity is waning for reasons that we don't quite understand, I think that it does seem to be a weakness of the mRNA technology, that it doesn't hold up. There's a preprint I saw that came online recently. I think it was either in BioArchive or MedArchive, maybe suggesting a mechanism that mRNA is not inducing long-lasting plasma cells as well as we had hoped, and maybe it's not a problem with the other technologies. Our vaccine was a recombinant protein technology, but it really became important for Americans to get their booster. So I pushed that, and I'm still pushing it. I pushed on the bivalent booster last September, and I pushed on this new annual immunization that became available. No, I'm sorry, the September 2022, and then I pushed on the annual immunization that just became available. So in last September as well. But that is another factor. Yeah.
Yeah, this is really true. So there is this large number of people that didn't take the vaccine, didn't take the boosters, and the communication often of what needed to happen was a little bit confusing to many. It's various things to be unpacked here.
But one of the things, Stefano, to mention is, this comes up a lot now. I think what you're seeing is now, with my finding 200,000 Americans needlessly died, and I actually point fingers at specific individuals, elected members of the Senate and House, and identify the role of Fox News, and I can go into that if you want as well. But what you're seeing now is this kind of revisionist history being taking place, this lack of accountability. So after I've made that accusation, and back it up, what you're seeing now is this big effort to revise history, and it's taking three forms. Number one is you're seeing this play out now. Some of this play out in the House COVID subcommittee hearings, which is run by the GOP. They're trying to say no, it was the vaccines that killed Americans, not COVID-19, which is absolute nonsense. Second, they want to blame the scientists for making the COVID virus, which is also absolute nonsense. And the third is to make the statements that the reason this screwed up is because the CDC and all the public health people miscommunicated, and so they lost the trust of Americans. There were flaws, and we can go into it too, and I could tell you what the flaws were in our communications policy from the HHS agencies and others. But that was a small piece of it. What the real piece of it was the weaponization of health communications by bad actors who are politically motivated. And I think that's important to keep in mind, because whenever I hear, it's because, the CDC were such terrible communicators, they weren't terrible communicators. They were imperfect communicators. So were the other health and human services agencies. So were a lot of public health agencies, with fast changes in a pandemic. But in normal times, that would not have had such a devastating effect. The real reason was the bad actors with nefarious intent were weaponizing any little weakness they could find. And I think that's important to say as well.
Let's get into that, Peter. And I want to quote from a quote from your book where you quote the father of microbiology, Louis Pasteur, and the quote that you report is, "A known enemy is already half disarmed," right? And so we should have been celebrating the fact that the known enemy became known so quickly. Not only that, but the known prevention, like the vaccine, became available so quickly. Never happened in history at that speed. So why? Why there are fractions of society and leaders in Congress that are actually opposing, wanting to know the enemy and fight the enemy? So think about it. We could not unite ourselves, we could not unite the world against a virus, which is which is not even human, right? So we're not trying to solve the Palestinian-Israeli crisis here, which are all human, right? This is a foreign entity in a certain sense. And we could not, despite knowing it, despite having the weapons, we fought, among each other on that. Why is that? To what end? Who has to gain to that?
By the way, the reason I put in that Pasteur quote of known enemies half disarmed is because, by talking about politics, it puts us in a very uncomfortable position, right? All of my training, your training as well, probably said, as scientists, we don't talk about Republicans and Democrats and liberals or conservatives and red states or blue states. But I say, look, it's not that I care about your politics, but somehow we have to uncouple the anti-science from the politics. And I haven't found a way to talk about it other than to talk about it. So I talk about it, I wrote about it. And the point is, a known enemies have to start. We can't begin to chip away at it unless we have an honest discussion about it. But that's a side point. So how did this begin? It actually is again, in terms of vaccines, I mean, President Trump was a problem in that he pushed hard on the hydroxychloroquine, back in early 2020,
Yeah.
and even before ivermectin, it was originally hydroxy. That's why they cut me off of Fox News, because I was going on Fox News pretty regularly, but I wouldn't go along with the hydroxychloroquine nonsense. The attacks on vaccines are a post-Trump phenomenon, actually. So it started at the CPAC Conference of Conservatives, which happened to be held in Dallas in 2021, as the Delta wave was accelerating. And the rhetoric there coming out of the CPAC conference was, first they're going to vaccinate you, then they're going to take away your guns and your Bibles. And as ridiculous as that sounds to us, people in my state of Texas and Oklahoma and Arkansas accepted that. And they brought in all these prominent anti-vaxxers, to disparage vaccines. And so what happened was, in their zeal to push back against potential vaccine mandates, they went the next step, and they basically falsely discredited the effectiveness and safety of vaccines, and that's what started to become so dangerous. And in fact, the Associated Press wrote an article about the CPAC conference with the title "They Clapped at Death for COVID." I mean, people were cheering about the fact that people weren't getting vaccinated. It was sick. It was horrible. And then the pylon came, and the pylon came from members of the House Freedom Caucus, because this was the propaganda: health freedom, medical freedom. You can't tell us what to do. And Marjorie Taylor Greene called people like me medical brown shirts, started comparing vaccines to the Holocaust, or Representative Jim Jordan of Ohio, or Senator Rand Paul.
Also targeting you as a Jewish as well.
Well, I was targeted. Definitely was targeted for Jewish. Not by her for being Jewish.
No,
but and then it was Ron Johnson, Senator Ron Johnson, to hold these phony baloney vaccine injury roundtables, and boy, that did damage. And then the coup de grace was Fox News, and this was documented by two groups: Media Matters, a watchdog group, as well as a social science research group out of ETH Zurich, the Federal University of Science and Technology of Switzerland, which is like the MIT of Central Europe, where Einstein studied, documented every night during that Delta wave in the summer. Tucker Carlson, Laura Ingraham, Sean Hannity filled their broadcasts with anti-vaccine content. So what happened was, it was a whole organized ecosystem convincing Americans not to take vaccines. So if you were watching Fox News every night, listening to your elected leaders on the far right, watching Joe Rogan podcasts, because at this time Rogan started only bringing on the anti-vaccine activists in the last half of 2021, you basically went down a rabbit hole. In that rabbit hole, the message was, don't take vaccines. Vaccines don't work or are dangerous, and you can take ivermectin instead. And people paid for that with their lives. And I talk about it, even though it's so painful to talk about, because I don't want to see it happen again. How do we? Again, it's not that I care about your political views. I don't care if you watch Joe Rogan. I don't care if you watch Fox News. But how do we uncouple the anti-science from it? So so it doesn't happen because it's became such a lethal force. I mean, 200,000 Americans. Wow. I mean, I never thought I would see that. And you know, you don't, you know, and I saw a lot of it firsthand being here in Texas, where the vaccination rates were lowest. Not so much in Houston, but you know, when you go onto the more conservative, some of the rural areas, East Texas, Central Texas, Panhandle, you talk to people, and everyone's lost a loved one because they refused the COVID vaccine. That's where you really begin to understand it.
The drama here. Let me go further on this, on the causes of this. At the very beginning of your book, and I'm reading a sentence. You said, I explain why anti-science has started to globalize, extending into Canada and Western Europe, and even to low and middle income countries in Africa and elsewhere. So let me play for a second with words, not play with words, but use the word globalization and started. You and I had this conversation before, but I'd like to follow up and go a little bit further. So it seems like that the anti-science started to globalize, and if you allow me for a second, I'll take the opposite sequence of events here. I would put forward the idea that actually globalization per se is a cause of the anti-science movement. So, if you think about it, in 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, and we thought that now, without the ideology, we could have all come together, right? The whole world to solve the big problems and be together. And there was a moment where we thought that that was really happening. However, quickly didn't go
And
that.
there was that book, right? The End of History, wasn't it? Wasn't it Francis Fukuyama who wrote a book called The End of History or
Is that
something?
right? I haven't read that. Yeah,
Yeah,
I'll go look for it.
I think that came along around then.
Yeah, that could be.
If only, right?
If only, yeah, if
Yeah.
only, yeah, how we were wrong about that. And what happened very quickly instead is that globalization became a financial tool, essentially, and has been dominating the whole world. And what happened is that a large swath of society in the United States, think about the Rust Belt in Europe and in many areas, people lost their jobs, lost their future, because all those jobs were moved to China and other places where it was cheaper to produce, and the logic of globalization, became that. And these people are really upset, and I think that they feel they've been betrayed by the elites. In this case, mostly the governments and the politicians who were running all this. But I think that this deep dissatisfaction has actually spilled over into science, and that scientists are also perceived as an elite. And so we get caught into this dissatisfaction, upset movement all around the world, which maybe doesn't have to do anything that specific with not believing in the vaccine, but we'll take on everything that we can to disagree with those who we think, are doing us a disservice because they're elitist or perceived that way. So does that make any sense to you? Or
It actually does. In fact, I talk a little bit about it in the book, and that's what happened, with Stalin and the Great Purge. It wasn't just
yeah,
against the scientists,
you
right? It
mentioned
was
that.
the intelligentsia. It was the intellectuals who were considered a threat to the system. In fact, Hannah Arendt, in The
Yep.
Origins of Totalitarianism, writes about the same thing, as does Anne Applebaum or Ruth Ben Gad, or people who look at authoritarian regimes, or populist governments. You have to have an enemy, and the enemy includes the elites, and I think there is definitely some truth to that. So you see this kind of attack not only against science but intellectuals as well. And I said it began with the attacks on climate science and scientists. And I'm now working with Michael Mann, who's a climate scientist, very distinguished climate scientist at Penn, and on comparing notes between the attacks on climate science with the attacks on biomedical science, and there's quite a bit of overlap. So we just agreed to write a new book together, which will be out next year on that topic, comparing the two, and so I think there definitely was a component of that, and how we bring that back, and then you see in the attacks on me, right? I get accused. I mean, what are the accusations? Well, they say, one, I'm a pharma shill, because they tie up the pharma companies with this as well, even though we develop low
You
cost
made a
vaccines. We do
vaccine
the
without any patent.
no patent, and make low cost. We've provided a model showing how you could bypass the big pharma companies. I don't think it's right to demonize them either. They do what they do, but we wanted to provide an alternative model. So I think that or they will say, that I'm, part of this cabal launched at the World Economic Forum. That's another big one. But I've never been invited to Davos. I've never been invited to the World Economic Forum either. Or
You're guilty by association.
the most disgusting of all, though, is they'll say it's, the Jews, right? It's, they'll call it the Jews or the globalists, and they'll put me up there in a picture with, I don't know, Rochelle Walensky and Albert Bourla, the CEO of Pfizer, and Jacob Rothschild, and this kind of thing. And in fact, I wound up writing a follow-on, not a book, but a paper that was published in Perspectives in Biology and Medicine, called On Anti-Science, on Anti-Semitism. And because, not that the two circles of the Venn diagram completely overlap by any means, but there is an interesting partial overlap, just like in the Weimar Republic, they accused Einstein's relativity of being the Jewish fraud, or the Jewish
That's
scientist,
true.
as opposed to more muscular
Incredible.
Aryan physics, or they said the same thing about Freud and psychoanalysis, and so there's that very dark thread as well. And then, of course, the Jews started the pandemic because of, that's what they'll say, because they're profiting through vaccine. They wanted to make a
The
profit through
companies. Yeah.
vaccines, and just that goes back to the 1300s of the Jews in Europe poisoning the wells, and it's
Yeah.
amazing
Yeah,
how
no, it's history repeats
ago.
itself, huh?
Yeah.
And for those who don't understand it, they're condemned by that. Exactly. So, with this in mind, I know all that you're doing, but if this is the picture, and I'm glad we see it in a similar way on the causes. So often what we see are symptoms of underlying distress, right or wrong. It is what it is. I also would add that overlaid on top of this, completely independent, but the timing is completely overlapping, is the rise of social media, which has completely created a situation where experts are not needed, because through social media everybody knows everything, right? Everybody can say anything, and so again, the role of the expert is really carved out.
Yeah,
Not carved.
I mean, conspiracies are as old as humankind, right? But the problem now, they get amplified either because of the cable news channels, or because of Twitter, or what Elon Musk has done to Twitter to turn it into X, and invite back all the most hateful anti-vaccine conspiracists, and that kind of thing. So it's taken, and yet again, a very dark and very huge platform right now, that I do worry about very much.
Exactly. And to this end, actually, I strongly recommend everyone to read Walter Isaacson, great biography of Elon Musk. If we want to understand, how some leaders think in that direction, it's really, really interesting
Does
as
he
well.
get into that? Because I haven't read it. I love Walter Isaacson stuff, and his Einstein
Yeah,
biography.
no, you should read it. Walter finishes the book toward the beginning of Elon Musk acquiring Twitter, so the social media per se is a small part of the book. But I think the thinking all along through the pandemic and the libertarian aspect or so are well unpacked, and are very interesting to whether you agree or not. It doesn't matter, but it's important to
I mean,
know.
I think the toughest part is, how do we walk this back now?
And that's where I was going. Thank you for going
And
there.
I wish I could say, because it's a political problem, and I don't think the health sector, the scientists, really know what to do at this point. It's, how do you, again, we don't care about your political views, or at least I don't. But how do you uncouple the anti-science? How do you say
Exactly.
don't adopt this one? I mean, when I moved to Texas 14 years ago to come to the Texas Medical Center, Baylor, and Texas Children's Hospital, I used to call them George H.W. Bush and Jim Baker Republicans. I got to know Jim Baker and Susan Baker, fantastic people. I didn't always agree with them politically, but you never doubted they cared about the country, and they cared about science. They, just like
Oh,
we
of
started
course.
out this conversation, right? They recognize more than anyone that we're a nation built on the strength of our research universities. How do you bring that back to the GOP to restore that?
To
And
everyone, and that's exactly the point. So let me ask you, so what can we do as scientists to do exactly that? I'll turn the question back to you. I'll tell you an anecdote. No, it's a real thing, but it happened to me at an event. I won't get into the specifics. Where after a major award, a scientist stands up to give a speech in acceptance, and it was great. There's nothing wrong with that. But at a certain point, he turned to the audience and say, "Hey, you're all scientists, and you should go out and teach people, educate people about the value of science. They need to understand," and da 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 da. And I felt that that was a wrong tone, not because it's not correct, but I felt if I had to say something under these circumstances, I would have said, and by the way, go out of here, you scientists, and listen to people. So, do you think that we as scientists are listening enough to people and to their needs?
no, for the simple reason it's not part of our culture, or at least not anymore. If it ever was, but right now, if you're a scientist, trying to make a living as a professional scientist, and I'll speak primarily about academia since that's my I've spent my whole life in the university, although I've been out and about because of making vaccines and things. But the problem is the system is set up for us to write and speak for each other. That's how we get promoted, right? You write your grants and
That's where the incentives are. Yeah.
you write your grants in your field, and you write your scientific papers in your field. And I mean, I get evaluated like everybody else, and I don't see patients anymore. But what do they ask me about? They ask me my grants and my papers, preferably in what they call high impact factor journals.
Ooh, don't use that term.
And
It's
we
banned
can
at ASM.
well, it's certainly Bandit Plus as well, but that's unfortunately it still permeates.
I started the Declaration of Research Assessment against
Oh,
the
good
Journal
for
Impact
you. Good for
Factor,
you.
DORA. Yeah.
At Plus, we started these article specific
Yeah.
metrics to get around it. But
Sorry, I had to
unfortunately,
say that.
no, you're totally right. We're in complete agreement on this, but you get the idea. We're
Yep.
basically evaluated grants and papers, and there's nowhere on there for. I mean, I don't even have a place on my annual evaluation form for the single author books I've written, including one with ASM Press, Forgotten
Yep.
People, Forgotten Diseases, or much less the cable news channel time I've spent as a volunteer. I never got paid for this, or opinion pieces, and certainly not social media. So the message that the academic health center is sending is, it's not important. That's the best it gets. The worst
Exactly.
is that it does even, and Baylor and Texas Children's are much better than most, but at a lot of academic health centers, they'll say, "Hey, you're an academic, you're free to speak on it whenever you want to, dot dot dot, but don't screw this up and
Yeah.
don't get the
Don't get us in
institution in
trouble.
trouble." Right. And so that's the sort of Damocles, right? And that has a very chilling effect. And the consequence of that is predicted and predictable. It's a vacuum, it's silence. And guess who's filling the silence? The What's filling the
Others.
silence is all of the people selling ivermectin and selling telemedicine Zoom calls to give you ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine, or the people with political motivations, and that dominates. Then it's most of the health information then becomes disinformation. So how do we fix that? Well, I think one, we have to, you know, to take rebuild or build for the first time science communication into our graduate training, into our postdoctoral training. By the way, not everybody wants to do it, nor should they be forced to do it. I mean, there are people, we know them, right, Stefano? We know really good people who want to just keep their head down and focus on the grants and papers and the experiments in the lab. And that's fine too. But there's a subset of people, and more commonly among young people, because I think the commitment to public service is at an all-time high, who want to be out there, but they're afraid to do it, and they don't know how to do it. And in both of us, we had to learn it by trial and error. In my case, more error than trial, I think. But but there is a way to do that, and I think if you started building in those programs, it would help. I think the other piece to this, though, is we also, in parallel, that's not the only thing going on. In addition to, and the scientists are invisible, right, as a consequence. So, you mentioned Research America before. They do this, Mary Woolley and Ellie Dahoney do this
Only
great survey every couple of years. How many
name the
Americans can name a
scientist.
living scientist,
Yeah.
and it's always around 3/4 of the American people cannot name a living scientist, and those who can, it's the first ones are Bill Nye
Neil deGrasse
and Neil
Tyson.
deGrasse, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, they're great people; they do important work, but they're not doing what I do, which is not slave, but
Discoveries. Yeah.
trying to figure out what the heck's going on at the lab meeting and revising a paper and dealing with reviewers' threes obnoxious comments and which I'm literally dealing with reviewer three's
Right
obnoxious
now.
comments right now as we speak,
We
and
all did.
grant applications that get not discussed, and you think that's unfair. It's hard work being a scientist, but the American people don't know what we do. We're invisible, and that's our fault, right? Instead they think of us. They don't think of us as people. They think of us as sort of these dark lurking figures wearing white coats, hiding in the shadows, and so that we have, and that has also created a huge problem. So we can get dehumanized very easily. So I think that would help. But that's not the only thing that's going on. The other thing that's going on is the science journalists are disappearing.
Hmm.
Right,
True.
right. National Geographic just laid off a bunch of
Mhm.
reporters. Popular Science, I think, is laid off huge numbers of people. The mainstream
News
media
outlets. Yeah.
doesn't have science journalists anymore. So that's a problem. I think the third is we need to put more doctoral level scientists in K through 12. I think that could help a lot too. I wrote a blog or an article a few years ago. It got absolutely no notice, but I still think it's a good idea to say, for some with a PhD, wouldn't it be great if they could get well-paying jobs in K through 12? To really understand how science is done from a scientist. And I even named it after Richard Feynman, the great physicist. I
Yeah.
called it the Feynman Scholars, and
Yeah.
so you could Google my name and Feynman. I still think that those are things that we need to do. It's not going to
Could not
fix
agree
every,
more.
but it still will not address how do we stop people from the extreme right of targeting and
Absolutely.
demonizing scientists, and that's where nobody wants to talk about it because we always have to be politically neutral, right?
Exactly.
And neutrality in this case, to paraphrase Desmond Tutu or Elie Wiesel's, favoring the aggressor in this case.
Yeah. So it's absolutely correct, and that is that is difficult. I would say, Peter, is not just about communication, which is a big component of it. I think it's also a culture in the scientific environment, of engagement with people, because we tend to think, as we were trained as scientists, you're trained to be a scientist, right? You're not trained to be a citizen, and the two things are not antagonistic, and one of the things that I don't want to make this a promotional spot for ASM at all, but what I'm particularly proud of our new strategic plan at ASM is that one of our core values in this plan, we call it science in service. And I think that is really hinting at this changing this culture, right? And scientists themselves understanding that they're serving people, they're serving humanity in solving big problems. And some people may choose to do that, as you said, in the lab, day in, day out, and they don't have any interest of going on in communication, which is perfectly fine. Others, like you, may put themselves on the front line, and there it doesn't matter. But I think it's very important for academia, for industry, for everyone to really understand the cultural aspects of this. That science is not separated from society; it is an integral
I
part of that.
completely agree, and I think if although we don't talk about it, I think most scientists are also humanists, and most scientists have a humanitarian purpose to their work. I mean, for me, making vaccines is a little more straightforward to articulate, but even somebody doing very basic biology on microbes, I think if you were to take the time to ask them, I think what would come out is people wanted scientists want to do good
Right.
in the world,
But
and
it feels we keep it in the cold room in the lab rather than
that's right. That's right. It's literally in the cold room. And so how do we, take that
exactly.
out and get people to feel comfortable talking about it?
I think that in a sense is the question or the answer to the question that you were posing, right? How do we get out of this pickle, so to speak? I think it take that culture and that attitude out of the cold room. There's no need to hide it, and engage. I think that's a
Yeah. I
very
mean, we're still going to need our champions
yep.
in the Congress and in the Senate and the
And
House
there are
and
some great
in the White
ones,
House.
and so, which we're trying to support as
I
much as
think we
we can.
also need our the executive branch to be a little more out in front supporting scientists. We haven't really heard from the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy about all the craziness that's going on. We've not heard from PCAST, President's Councils on
Mhm.
Science and Technology, about what's going on. So there is this, there's this.
There's a vacuum.
It's not just the words of the enemies; it's the silence of the friends, and
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
for me the toughest part.
So let me switch gear a second, but very related to what you're talking about, and you already alluded to it. We're very proud that in 2021 we have published the third edition at ASM of your book, "Forgotten People, Forgotten Diseases." So, Peter, why is it important for an American scientist like you to study neglected tropical disease? What do we have to do with it?
Well, that was another vacuum that actually came in around the same time as the phony baloney claims about vaccines causing autism. It actually happened in response to, at that time I was in Washington D.C. I was chair of microbiology at George
GW.
Washington. Yeah, and the Millennium Development Goals were launched, and with it, Kofi Annan, UN Secretary General, brought all the global leaders to United Nations headquarters for the shared goals for poverty reduction, and there was one for infectious diseases, and it was called "To Combat HIV/AIDS, Malaria, and Other Diseases." And suddenly, I realized all of the other diseases that I was studying for my whole life, like hookworm and schistosomiasis. I said, what the heck? They're actually calling them other diseases, which from an advocacy standpoint was an absolute disaster. So
Yeah.
I started working with two colleagues from the UK, David Molyneux, who was the head of the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, Alan Fennick at Imperial College London. And we went and did some branding exercise and labeled them neglected tropical disease, found their common features, and they gradually became a thing, and that was great. That helped, I think, mobilize awareness, and it was, and not only was it meaningful, it was actually fun. It was actually, that was my, there, here I was in D.C. in Rome at the height of the Roman Empire, and would get into a taxi and go down to the Senate office buildings, the House office buildings, and one of the things that I learned is that as a scientist, as a subject matter expert, people will listen to you if you're willing to take the time to go out of the lab, and that was terrific. And of course, and we got money appropriated through USAID for support of
That's
neglected tropical
fantastic. Yeah.
disease. Now, of course, it was a little different than at that time. Republicans actually spoke to Democrats, and Democrats spoke to Republicans. So I could go to
These were the years of the
at,
doubling of the
at,
NIH
at that
budget.
yeah, and at that time Sam Brownback was before he was governor of Kansas, he was senator from Kansas. I would go to his prayer breakfast meeting, and then I would walk across the hall to see Senator Leahy's people, and he was just like to the far left in terms of his political views, and working together to draft legislation, no problem. It wasn't even considered very unusual at that time. So I benefited from that grace period in in Washington politics.
Yeah, you mentioned breakfast prayers, and this got a light bulb on my in my brain. Thinking, for example, when we were talking about engaging scientists in society, for example, how valuable it would be for scientists to engage with faith-based organization, and going to meet people where they are. Often we speak to the choir. We could be singing in gibberish, and they would still be clapping, right? But that's not, we're not going to change the problem that we discussed through that.
Yeah, I mean, that is one of the blessings of being here in Texas. I mean, sometimes,
True.
people look at me, like, on here in the medical center, look at me like Moses in the desert, why did you bring us here? And I'll say, wait a minute, you could be at Penn or Harvard or UCSF where everybody agrees with you, or you can be down here and try to make a difference. And that's meaningful as well.
Exactly. So no, this is absolutely wonderful, and I am so glad of this conversation, Peter, and all that you are doing. And I also want to remind everyone that we'll have another conversation with you at ASM Microbe meeting in Atlanta in this coming June on Sunday, June 16 at 5:30 p.m. And this is part of a new series going exactly trying to address this issue that we're discussing here of science and societies, science and society, where at ASM Microbe meeting, we always have a speaker to talk about this issue. And we're delighted to have you. And you'll be interviewed by Jonathan Capehart, who just interviewed President Biden after the State of the Union address. So you're appropriately the next distinguished.
Well, he's terrific. I did a number when he was with MSNBC. I did a number of interviews with him during the pandemic. He's great.
Wonderful. To wrap this up, and thanking you for all the time that you dedicated to us, I hope we did not contribute to missing out on the appropriate answer to reviewer number 3, which can't be satisfied anyway, typically reviewer number 3. So I'd like to say, Peter, that I don't know what the solutions are to all of this big problem, but I have a sense, at least in my mind, of what we need. And to think at a high level, what I think we need is, number one, I think we need social capital. Seems to be missing in spades. Highly trusted networks. That's what I mean by social capital. I also think that we need strong institutions. I always think in this, President Lincoln, you mentioned Washington before, when I drive by the Lincoln Memorial, I always think about that, someone who kept the country together, and doing the right thing in history, while keeping the different opinion and the different people, together. That is what we need, strong institution. And the third one is, in a sense, not the opposite, but the complement of this. It's shared stories. We need to be part of a community. We need to be part of. You may have different views, but we need to come together. I see that these are 3 ingredients that are probably missing these days, but are essential. And I want to quote one last thing from your book toward the end. You propose a framework for combating anti-science aggression, and you talk about the need of a clearinghouse organization. So tell us a little bit about this, and how could we bring, if you agree, these 3 components together, in a framework so that all scientists can feel part and empowered to work in this direction?
Yeah, I think there's kind of 3. When I get together with other scientists, and and after we wring our hands for half an hour saying what the heck is going on, to me it distills down to 3 circles of a Venn diagram, each with partial overlap. So I think one is there's always room to improve science communication. That's and expand our visibility. That's one of the circles of the Venn diagram. Directly combating misinformation, I think that's also really important. And I know people like Reed Tuxen and others have created this coalition for
Yep.
trust in health and science, and
Yep.
maybe that's a start.
And
There's
Bill
a third.
Novelli, I think, is part of that.
Who's that?
Bill Novelli also is
Oh
part
yeah,
of it.
Bill. No, definitely Bill Novelli. Definitely, and he's terrific. And there's a third circle though, and that is defending the scientists, and that's the part that no one wants to take on. So in the book, I proposed creating, and I just to and not being an expert in this and knowing there's no roadmap, looking at what the climate scientists have done, and they've created a climate science defense fund for that purpose. Because I'm in a good position in terms of got the full backing of Baylor College of Medicine, Texas Children's Hospital, and I'm a full professor. But what if you're a mid-career person who doesn't have the support of their institution? It's a very lonely place to be. So we need to have some resources for that person to go to. So should we create something like a climate science defense fund for the biomedical scientists, working on viruses and that sort of thing? The other term I used was Southern Poverty Law Center, another type of clearinghouse type organization. And now we're starting to talk to some potential funders. We're, for instance, talking to the George and Cynthia Mitchell Foundation about doing something in that space. It's not something a lot of foundations want to rush into. It's because they don't, they just, I don't know what, they seem to be generally fairly risk averse, but there's a
Yeah.
couple that have definitely expressed an interest in it. So we'll see where that goes.
Glad you're thinking in this direction. Peter, I'd like to really thank you for your time together. This has been a great conversation. I really enjoyed hearing your thoughts on this. And thank you for all that you do. And I'll see you in Atlanta in June.
Well, thank you, Stefano, for all the important work you're doing at ASM and for giving scientists like myself, microbiologists, a voice in this. This is so critically important.
That's why we're in business, because of you.
Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.